The wind in Cinder Gulch did not blow so much as it scoured. It carried the grit of 3 territories, a relentless, dry abrasive that stripped the paint from the clapboard storefronts and etched intricate spiderwebs into the glass of the saloon windows. It was the late 1870s, and the settlement sat on the jagged edge of cattle country like a scab that refused to heal. The main street was nothing more than 2 ruts of hard-packed earth, flanked by warped buildings that leaned away from the prevailing gusts as if trying to crawl back into the earth. There was no church in Cinder Gulch, but there was a saloon that never quite slept, a place where the lanterns burned low and the whiskey burned hot, offering the only solace available in a land that seemed determined to kill anything that tried to take root. Mara stood by the splintered railing of the corral, the wind whipping strands of dark hair across her face. She pushed them back with a hand that was red and chapped, the skin roughened by lye soap and freezing water. She was 19 years old, but the sun and the wind had already begun to tighten the corners of her eyes. She wore a dress of faded calico that had been mended so many times the patches were more structural than the original fabric. Her boots were men's boots, stuffed with rags to make them fit, the leather cracked and gray with dust. She picked up the heavy wooden bucket at her feet. It was half full of brown, sluggish water she had drawn from the creek a mile away. The well having gone dry 3 weeks past, her back ached with a dull, thumping rhythm. A companion she had known since she was 12. Inside the corral, the family's last cow, a bony roan with a clouded eye, lowed softly. The animal was sick, its ribs pushing against its hide like the staves of a barrel. "Drink," Mara whispered, hefting the bucket over the rail. The cow dipped its muzzle, drinking slowly. Mara watched, her chest tight. This animal was the difference between a winter with milk and butter or a winter of dry biscuits and lard. She looked toward the small, sod-roofed house that sat 50 yards away. The chimney was cold. Her father, Elias, had not chopped wood before he left. He had not mended the fence where the coyotes had dug under. He had not looked at the sky to see the storm clouds gathering over the peaks to the north. He had simply gone to town. Mara gripped the rail, her knuckles white. She remembered a time when Elias had been different. She remembered him lifting her onto his shoulders to see a parade in St. Louis, his laugh booming like thunder. She remembered him pointing to this valley and calling it the Garden of Eden. But the years of drought, the locusts of '74, and the fever that took her mother had hollowed him out. The hope had leaked out of him, replaced by a bitter, fermented anger that he nursed with cheap liquor. He cursed the land now. He cursed the government. He cursed the grave behind the house. And sometimes, when the whiskey was deep in his blood, he looked at Mara with a gaze that blamed her simply for surviving when everything else had died. She turned back to the work. There was no one else to do it. The air inside the dusty saloon was thick with tobacco smoke and the sour reek of unwashed bodies and spilled beer. It was a dark, cavernous space where men hid from the blinding glare of the sun. Elias sat at a corner table, his shoulders hunched, staring into the bottom of an empty glass. He was a man who had begun to shrink inside his own clothes. His coat hung loose, and his beard was a tangled thicket of gray and brown, stained with tobacco juice. He turned the glass over. Not a drop remained. He felt the familiar clawing in his gut, the desperate, trembling need that overrode pride and sense. He stood up, swaying slightly, and made his way to the bar. The floorboards creaked under his boots. "Bartender," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves dragging on stone. "Put another on my slate. The barkeep," a man with forearms the size of cured hams, did not look up from the glass he was ragging. "Your slate is full. Elias, it has been full since last month." Elias gripped the edge of the bar. "I am good for it. The calf. The roan is dropping a calf soon. I will bring it in." "You have promised that calf to the blacksmith in the dry goods store," the barkeep said flatly. "No more credit." A heavy silence fell over the nearby drinkers. Then, a voice cut through the gloom, smooth and dangerous as oil on a whetstone. "Let the man have a drink." "Silas." Elias turned. Sitting at a poker table in the center of the room was Harlan Pike. Harlan was everything Elias was not. He was clean-shaven, his skin glowing with the health of a man who ate beef every night. He wore a suit of dark wool, a silk vest, and a hat that cost more than Elias's farm was worth in a good year. Harlan was a cattle buyer, a land speculator, a man who bought desperate people's dreams for pennies on the dollar and sold them for gold. Harlan smiled, revealing teeth that were white and even. In fact, bring the bottle. I will sit with my friend Elias. Elias felt a rush of pathetic gratitude mixed with shame. He stumbled over to Harlan's table and sat down. Harlan poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass and pushed it across the green felt. Elias seized it, his hands shaking so badly he had to use both to lift it to his lips. He drank it in one gasp, the fire searing his throat and settling in his stomach with a warm, numbing weight. "Thank you, Mr. Pike," Elias mumbled, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Harlan leaned back, his eyes cold and predatory, like a hawk watching a field mouse. "We have business to discuss. Elias, the matter of your debt to me." Elias flinched. The warmth in his belly turned to ice. "I know, Harlan, I know. The winter was hard. The feed costs." "You owe me $300, Harlan said softly. It was a fortune. It was an impossible sum. "I just need time," Elias pleaded. "Time is money," Harlan said. He drummed his fingers on the table. "You have nothing left to sell. Elias, your land is mortgaged to the bank. Your cattle are skin and bone. You are a man with nothing to trade." Elias stared at the table, the shame burning his cheeks. He reached for the bottle, but Harlan's hand shot out and covered it. "Not yet," Harlan said. "We are negotiating." "What do you want?" Elias whispered. "I have nothing." Harlan looked around the room. He saw the other men watching, cowhands, drifters, broken farmers. He enjoyed an audience. He enjoyed seeing how low a man would crawl. He leaned in close, the smell of bay rum and expensive cigars wafting from him. "You have a daughter?" Elias blinked, his sodden brain trying to make sense of the words. "Mara? She is a strong girl," Harlan said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden quiet of the room. "Young, hard-working. I have need of a housekeeper out at the Canyon Ranch. Someone to cook, clean, mend clothes, a woman's touch. She is all I have to run the place," Elias stammered. "The place is dead." "Elias," Harlan said, "and so are you. If you do not pay me." Harlan swirled his drink. "Tell you what, a joke, really, a wager between friends. You give me the girl to work off your debt, and I will wipe the slate clean. $300, gone, and I will give you this bottle to take home. Also, $20 credit at the bar." Elias looked at the bottle. He looked at Harlan's smiling face. He heard a ripple of laughter from the men at the bar. It was a nervous, cruel sound. They were laughing at the absurdity of it. A daughter for a bar tab, a human being for a debt. Some of the men looked away, studying their boots, uncomfortable with the darkness that had just entered the room. But no one spoke. Harlan Pike owned half the county's paper. No one crossed him. "She is a good girl," Elias whispered, the words tasting like bile. "Then she will make a good worker," Harlan said. He pulled a piece of paper from his vest pocket. It was scrawled with ink, already prepared. He set a small vial of ink and a pen on the table. "Sign here." Elias looked at the paper. The words swam before his eyes. He thought of Mara's face, stern and disappointed. He thought of the cold house. Then he looked at the bottle of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light of the lantern. It promised oblivion. It promised a night without memory. "It is just work," Elias muttered to himself. "Just work for a spell. It is for the best." He picked up the pen. His hand shook, scratching a jagged X and a messy signature across the bottom of the page. Harlan snatched the paper away. Blowing on the ink to dry it, he slid the full bottle across the table. "Done," Harlan said, his voice devoid of humor now. "I will come for her at dawn. Have her ready." Elias grabbed the bottle and stood up, nearly knocking the chair over. He did not look at Harlan. He did not look at the other men. He stumbled toward the door, clutching the glass neck of the bottle as if it were a lifeline. stepping out into the howling wind that waited to swallow him whole. Mara woke with a start. The wind was rattling the loose shutter against the log wall, but that was not what had roused her. It was the sound of the door slamming and the heavy, stumbling footsteps of her father. She sat up in the darkness, pulling the thin quilt up to her chin. The air in the cabin was freezing. She heard the clink of glass on wood, then the sound of a cork being pulled. "Pa?" she called out softly. Elias did not answer immediately. She heard him drinking, the glug-glug-glug of the bottle in the silence, then a heavy sigh. "Go back to sleep, girl," he mumbled. Mara lit the tallow candle by her bed and walked into the main room. Elias was sitting at the rough-hewn table, the bottle already a quarter empty. He looked up at her, and she stopped. His eyes were red-rimmed and swimming with moisture, but beneath the drunkenness, she saw something terrified and evasive. "What happened?" she asked. "We're settling up," he said, slurring his words. "I fixed it. Mara, I fixed the debt." "How?" Mara asked, suspicion sharpening her voice. "You had no money. I made a deal," Elias said. He waved a hand vaguely. "Harlan Pike, he offered you a job." "A job?" "Housekeeping. At his big ranch. Good pay. Well, it pays the debt." Mara felt a cold stone drop into her stomach. Harlan Pike was a name spoken in whispers by the women in town. He was a man who looked at women as if they were prize fillies at an auction. "I am not working for Harlan Pike," she said firmly. "We will find another way. I will sell the quilt. I will take in washing in town." "It is done," Elias shouted, slamming his hand on the table. The sudden violence made Mara jump. "I signed the paper. You go at dawn." "You signed a paper?" she whispered. He refused to meet her eyes. He stared at the bottle. "It is for the best. You will have a warm roof, food. It is better than starving here with me." "You sold me," she said. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. "You sold me for your tab. It ain't like that," Elias cried, his voice cracking. "It is work, just work." Mara looked at the bottle in his hand. She saw the fresh level of the liquid. She saw the defeat in his posture. She realized then that her father had died a long time ago. This thing sitting before her was just a husk filled with spirits and shame. "I will not go," she said, her voice trembling. "You have to," Elias whispered, collapsing over the table, burying his face in his arms. "He will take the land. He will take everything. I had no choice." Mara stood there for a long time, watching the candle gutter. The wind howled outside, sounding like a chorus of screaming voices. She did not sleep again. She sat on the edge of her bed, fully dressed, her boots laced tight, waiting for the sun to bring the end of her life. Dawn arrived, not with golden light, but as a bruising of purple and gray on the eastern horizon. The air was frigid, the ground covered in a layer of frost that looked like ash. Mara heard the jingle of harness and the creak of wagon wheels long before she saw them. She walked out onto the porch, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Elias remained inside. He was awake. She could hear him pacing, but he was too cowardly to come out. A buckboard wagon pulled by two stout bays pulled up to the gate. Harlan Pike sat on the bench seat, wrapped in a buffalo hide coat, looking regal and cruel. Beside the wagon rode two men on horseback. One was a bearded man with a scar across his nose. The other was younger, a cowboy with a dark hat pulled low. Harlan smiled as he saw her. He did not step down. "Ready to go, my dear?" he called out. "I am not going anywhere with you," Mara said, her voice thin in the vast icy air. Harlan chuckled. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "Your father says otherwise. This is a legal contract. Services in exchange for debt. You can come willing, or you can come bound. It makes no difference to the horses." Mara looked back at the house. "Pa!" she screamed. "Pa, do not let him do this!" The door remained shut. The silence from the cabin was louder than the wind. Harlan nodded to the men. "Put her in the wagon." The bearded man dismounted, grinning, but the younger cowboy, the one with the dark hat, hesitated. He looked at the house, then at Mara. He had tired eyes, the color of wet slate. He looked like a man who had seen too much and said too little. He did not move. "Wyatt," Harlan barked. "Get down there." The young cowboy, Wyatt, swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. He did not look at Harlan. He walked toward the porch, his spurs chiming softly in the dirt. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at Mara. Up close, she saw the conflict in his face. His jaw was tight, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He did not grab her. He just stood there, blocking her path. "Please," Mara whispered to him. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel. "Do not make them drag you. It will only go worse." Mara looked at his eyes. There was no malice there, only a resigned weariness. He was a man following orders he hated, but following them nonetheless. The bearded man came up behind her, grabbing her arm with a grip like iron pincers. "Come on, little filly." Mara spun, trying to wrench free. "I am not yours." She kicked at the bearded man, landing a blow on his shin. He cursed and raised a hand to strike her, but Wyatt stepped in, catching the man's wrist. "Easy." Focused, Wyatt said. "Just get her in the wagon. No need to mark her." Harlan watched from the seat, amused. Mara was strong, but she was no match for two men. They half walked, half carried her to the wagon. She fought every step, digging her heels into the frozen dirt, leaving 2 long furrows in the earth of her home. They hoisted her into the back, where she fell onto a pile of scratchy wool blankets. Harlan snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward. Mara scrambled to her knees, gripping the tailgate. She watched the cabin retreat. The door finally opened, and Elias stepped out onto the porch. He was small and gray against the vast emptiness of the prairie. He held the bottle in one hand. He watched the wagon go. Then he raised the bottle to his lips. Something inside Mara fractured. It was a clean, sharp break, like a bone snapping. The grief that had been welling up in her throat instantly crystallized into something harder, colder. It was rage, pure, white-hot rage. "I will never forgive you," she said to the wind, her voice flat and deadly. "I will never forgive you, and I will never come back." The wagon rattled on, cresting the ridge. The cabin, the corral, and the broken man disappeared from view. Mara sat in the back, shivering not from the cold, but from the heat of the hate burning in her chest. The journey took all day. They moved away from the settlement, heading deep into the Badlands where the rock formations rose like twisted fingers from the earth. The country here was desolate, a maze of canyons and dry washes. Harlan Pike was in high spirits. He talked incessantly over his shoulder, his voice carrying back to where Mara sat huddled. He told crude jokes about women he had known in Abilene and Dodge City. He spoke of Mara's duties, his tone shifting from professional to insinuating. "You have good hands," he said, glancing back. "Strong. I like a woman with strong hands. You will scrub the floors first, then we will see about other tasks. A man gets lonely out here. A man needs comfort." Mara said nothing. She stared at the horizon, memorizing the shape of the hills, the position of the sun. She was not going to that ranch. She knew with a terrifying certainty that if she entered Harlan Pike's house, she would never leave it as herself. She would be broken, just as her father had been broken. Wyatt rode behind the wagon, trailing in the dust. Every time Mara looked up, she found him watching her. He did not leer like the bearded man. He watched her with a heavy, brooding intensity. When their eyes met, he would look away, pulling his hat brim lower. The sun began to dip, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and blood red. Harlan pulled the wagon into a small depression near a cluster of cottonwood trees. A dry creek bed ran through the center of the camp. "We camp here," Harlan announced. "Too dark to navigate the canyon trail." The men set about making a fire. The bearded man watered the horses. Wyatt gathered wood, moving with a quiet efficiency. Mara sat by the wagon wheel, refusing to move until Harlan grabbed her shoulder. "Get up," he said. "Cook us supper." Mara stood, shaking his hand off. "I am not your servant." "You are whatever I say you are," Harlan said. his voice dropping an octave. "You best learn that lesson quick. Girl," she cooked beans and salt pork over the fire, the smoke stinging her eyes. She ate nothing. The men ate greedily. Harlan produced a silver flask and passed it to the bearded man. He offered it to Wyatt, but the young cowboy shook his head. "I will take the first watch," Wyatt said, standing up. He walked out of the circle of firelight into the darkness. The night settled in, heavy and suffocating. The bearded man rolled into his blankets and was snoring within minutes. Harlan sat by the fire, watching Mara. She had retreated to the far side of the wagon, wrapping herself in her shawl. Harlan stood up and walked over to her. He loomed above her, blocking out the stars. "You are trembling," he said softly. "Go away," Mara said, pressing her back against the wood of the wagon wheel. Harlan crouched down. He reached out and took a lock of her hair, rubbing it between his fingers. "You cost me a lot of money. Mara, $40 for the debt, another $5 for the whiskey. That is a heavy price. I will work it off," she said, her voice shaking. "Scrubbing floors." Harlan laughed. A low, wet sound. "Scrubbing floors is for old women. You are young, you are pretty, in a dirty sort of way." He lunged suddenly, his hand clamping around her wrist. He yanked her toward him. Mara screamed, a short, sharp sound that was swallowed by the vastness of the prairie. She fought him, twisting like a wildcat. Harlan was strong, heavy with muscle and arrogance. He pressed her into the dirt, his whiskey-sour breath hot on her face. "Stop fighting," he growled. "You belong to me. Your daddy signed the paper." Mara's hand flailed in the dirt. She found a rock, but dropped it. Then her fingers curled into claws. As Harlan tried to pin her arms, she raked her fingernails across his face, digging deep into the cheek. Harlan roared in pain and surprise. He reared back, touching his face. His fingers came away bloody. "You little bitch," he shouted. He backhanded her. The blow knocked Mara sideways, her head striking the wagon wheel. Stars exploded in her vision. She tasted copper blood in her mouth. Harlan stood over her, breathing hard, blood streaming down his face. "You want to play rough? Fine. We will finish the journey tomorrow. And when we get to the ranch, I will tie you to the bedpost until you learn some manners." He kicked dirt at her and stalked back to his bedroll near the fire. Mara lay in the dirt, her head throbbing, her cheek pressed against the cold earth. She did not cry. The tears had dried up hours ago. She lay there and listened to the fire crackle, listened to Harlan's breathing slow into sleep. A shadow fell over her. She flinched, curling into a ball, expecting another blow. It was Wyatt. He stood silently in the dark, barely visible. He looked toward the fire where Harlan slept, then down at Mara. His face was unreadable in the gloom, but his hands were clenched at his sides. He knelt down. He did not touch her. He placed 3 items on the ground near her head: a canteen, a burlap sack containing dried beef jerky and biscuits, and a hunting knife with a bone handle. He looked at her, his eyes catching the faint starlight. He put a finger to his lips. He did not speak. To speak would be mutiny. To speak would be death if Harlan heard, but the message was clear. He stood up and walked silently away, moving to the perimeter of the camp to resume his watch. He stood with his back to her, staring out into the dark, making it clear he would see nothing that happened behind him. Mara stared at the knife. She waited. She waited until the moon began to slide down the western sky. She waited until the fire was nothing but dying embers. She waited until the pre-dawn chill was at its deepest, that hour when the world seems to hold its breath. She moved. She ignored the screaming pain in her head. She grabbed the canteen and slung the strap over her shoulder. She stuffed the jerky into her pockets. She took the knife, gripping the handle so tight her knuckles turned white. She looked at Harlan one last time. He was sleeping on his back, snoring softly. It would be so easy to walk over there and draw the blade across his throat. The thought tempted her. It sang to her, but she looked at the bearded man, his revolver close at hand. She looked at the distance to the horses. It was too risky. She chose freedom over vengeance. Mara slipped away from the wagon, moving as silent as a ghost. She crouched low, stepping carefully to avoid dry twigs. She moved past the sleeping men, past the horses that shifted and blew air through their nostrils but did not whinny. She reached the edge of the scrubby ravine. She looked back once. Wyatt was a silhouette against the stars, 50 yards away. He did not turn around. Mara slid down into the darkness of the ravine, the shale sliding softly under her boots. She hit the bottom and began to run. She ran despite the darkness, despite the rocks that tore at her dress. She ran toward the lightening line of the horizon, toward the unknown, leaving behind her father, her home, and the girl she used to be. The sun began to edge over the horizon, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise, as Mara disappeared into the wilderness. The sun was a hammer, and the earth was the anvil, and Mara was the raw iron being beaten between them. She had been walking for hours, though time had lost its meaning, measured only by the thumping of blood in her ears and the searing pain in her feet. The boots she wore were old, the leather stiff and unyielding, and her heels were already raw meat sliding against the rough interior with every step. She stumbled through a landscape that seemed designed by a hateful god to repel life. Dry gullies cut through the earth like open wounds, filled with loose shale that shifted treacherously underfoot. Thorn bushes, gray and twisted, clawed at the hem of her dress, leaving long, ragged tears in the fabric and scratches on her ankles that stung with sweat. The canteen Wyatt had left her thumped rhythmically against her hip. It was heavy, a burden on her bruised shoulder, but she clung to it as if it were a reliquary containing the bones of a saint. She had taken only small sips, letting the tepid water wet her cracked lips before swallowing, rationing it with a discipline born of terror. She stopped at the crest of a rise, her breath coming in ragged gasps that tasted of dust and sage. The land stretched out before her, vast and indifferent. It was a sea of brown and gray, rolling away to a horizon that shimmered in the heat haze. To the north, a line of low hills broke the monotony, purple and distant. She remembered the men in the saloon talking about a railroad town, a place where the iron tracks cut through the territory. They had said it lay beyond the hills, a place of noise and steam. It was a faint hope, fragile as a spider web, but it was the only direction she had. She pushed on. Her legs felt like lead weights. The silence of the plains was absolute, broken only by the dry rasp of cicadas and the crunch of her own boots. But then, the silence shattered. A gunshot echoed in the distance. It was a flat, popping sound, rolling off the canyon walls miles behind her. Mara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Then came another. They were signaling. Harlan had found her gone. She scrambled down into a dry wash, pressing herself into the shadow of a limestone overhang. She clutched the bone-handled knife Wyatt had left her, her fingers white around the hilt. She was shaking, a fine tremor that started in her core and rattled her teeth. She squeezed her eyes shut, imagining Harlan's face, the purple bruise of the scratch she had left on his cheek, the cold promise of violence in his eyes. 2 miles back, Wyatt sat atop his horse, watching the ground. The search party consisted of Harlan, the bearded foreman named Dutch, and 2 other hands hired for their ability to shoot straight and ask no questions. They had found the spot where she had slept, or rather, where she had waited. They had found the tracks leading into the ravine. She went south, Dutch said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto a flat rock. See here? Broken sagebrush. Boot print. Wyatt guided his horse closer, obscuring the clear print of a small boot heel with the hoof of his gelding. He leaned down, pretending to study the ground. That is an old track. Dutch, Wyatt said, his voice flat and unconcerned. Look at the edges. Wind has already blown dust into it. Must be from a drifted calf or a straggler from last week. Dutch frowned, squinting at the ground. Looks fresh to me. Wyatt pointed toward the ridge to the west, away from the low hills Mara was aiming for. Look at the birds circling over that ridge. Something spooked them. And the wind carries sound. If I was running, I would head for the broken country in the west, where the rocks hide a trail. She is a ranch girl. She knows not to walk in the open. Harlan Pike rode up, his face a mask of thunder. The scratch on his cheek was angry and red, crusted with dried blood. He looked like a man whose property had not only been stolen but had insulted him in the process. "Which way?" "Wyatt," Harlan demanded. Wyatt met Harlan's eyes. He felt a coil of sickness in his gut, a mix of fear and self-loathing that he had worked for this man for 5 years, but he kept his face still. "The west," he lied. "The ground is harder there." She would try to hide her sign. Harlan looked west, then south. He was a predator, but he was not a tracker. He relied on men like Wyatt. "Check the west ridge." Harlan barked at Dutch. "You two, ride the draw. Wyatt, you scour the creek bed to the east, just in case she doubled back. If you find her, fire 2 shots. If she resists—" Harlan paused, a cruel smile touching his lips. "Drag her back." The men spurred their horses. Wyatt watched them go, waiting until they were cresting the rise toward the west. Then he turned his horse east, toward the dry creek bed, riding slow. His jaw set so hard his teeth ached. He was not hunting her. He was saving her. But to do that, he had to play the part of the hound until the leash snapped. By late afternoon, the sun had turned the world into an oven. Mara had fallen twice, the second time. She had laid in the dirt for a long minute, the taste of alkaline dust coating her tongue, wondering if it would be easier to just stay there. The earth was warm, and the sky was a deep, endless blue. Dying here would be lonely, but it would be her own death. It would not belong to Harlan Pike. But the image of her father's face, weak, apologetic, trading her for a bottle, swam into her mind. The rage that had fractured inside her ignited again. She would not die. She would not let Elias be right. She would not let Harlan win. She forced herself up, staggering toward the cover of a cluster of scrub oaks near a dry creek bed. Her vision was blurring at the edges. Her water was gone. She had finished the last drop an hour ago. She crawled into the shade of the oaks, the dry leaves crackling under her weight. She curled into a ball, clutching the knife against her chest. Her breathing was shallow. The heat seemed to be pressing the life out of her, ounce by ounce. She closed her eyes, and the darkness took her, not into sleep, but into a gray, buzzing stupor. She did not hear the hoofbeats. They were soft, muffled by the sand of the creek bed. She did not hear the creak of leather or the jingle of a spur. The first thing she knew was a shadow blocking out the harsh light. She gasped, slashing out blindly with the knife. A hand caught her wrist. It was not a rough grip, but it was firm. "Easy," a voice said. "Easy. Mara, it is me." She blinked, her eyes streaming with grit and tears. Through the haze, she saw a hat, a dusty face, and eyes the color of slate. "Wyatt," she went limp, the fight draining out of her. You found me." He knelt beside her. He looked different than he had at the ranch. The exhaustion was still there, but the passivity was gone. He looked terrified. "They are headed west," he said, his voice hurried. "I sent them the wrong way, but they will circle back when they find no sign. We have maybe 2 hours of lead time." He uncapped his own canteen and held it to her lips. "Drink, slow now." The water was warm, but it tasted like sweet nectar. Mara choked on the first swallow, coughing, then drank greedily, until he pulled it away. "That is enough for now," he said. "You will make yourself sick." He looked at her bruised face, the dirt streaked with sweat, the bloody tatters of her dress. He looked at the way she curled in on herself, small and broken, but still holding that knife. A surge of emotion hit him so hard it nearly knocked the wind out of him. It was panic, yes, but beneath it was a fierce, roaring protectiveness that he had never felt for anything in his life. He had spent years driving cattle, protecting herds from wolves and rustlers. But that was a job. This was necessary. He stood up and offered her his hand. "Can you ride?" I do not know," she whispered. "I am not taking you back," he said, anticipating her fear. "I am done with him. I am done with all of it." He pulled her up, her legs buckled, and he caught her, sweeping her up into his arms. She was shockingly light, bird-boned and trembling. He carried her to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that stood ground-tied in the shade. He lifted her into the saddle, then swung up behind her. He wrapped one arm around her waist to steady her, taking the reins with the other. "Hold on," he said. "We have to ride hard." "Where?" she asked, her voice lost in the wind as he turned the horse. "The junction," he said. "The railroad. It is the only place big enough to get lost in." He spurred the horse, and they surged forward, leaving the dry creek bed and the life they had known behind. Wyatt did not look back. He had crossed a line. He had stolen Harlan Pike's property, stolen his horse, and effectively signed his own death warrant if they were caught. But as he felt Mara lean back against him, her body radiating a fragile heat, he knew he would kill anyone who tried to stop them. They rode until the moon was high and white, a polished bone in the black sky. The horse was blowing hard, its coat lathered with sweat. Wyatt finally pulled up in a small depression shielded by a rim of rock. It was not a good camp, but the horse needed rest, and he could feel Mara sagging against him, drifting in and out of consciousness. "We stop here for a few hours," he said, sliding out of the saddle. He helped her down. Her legs gave way immediately, and he lowered her gently to the ground. She groaned, a low sound of pain that cut through him. He unsaddled the horse and hobbled it nearby where there was a patch of dry grass. He did not light a fire. A fire was a beacon in this country. He spread his bedroll on the ground, a canvas tarp and a wool blanket. It was narrow, meant for one man. "Come here," he said gently. "You need to keep warm. The desert freezes at night." Mara crawled onto the blanket. She was shivering violently now, the sweat on her skin turning to ice in the night air. Wyatt lay down beside her. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness, only the brutal necessity of survival. He pulled the canvas over them both, tucking the edges in to trap their body heat. They lay on their sides, facing the same direction, spooned together in the cramped space. Mara's back was pressed against Wyatt's chest. He could feel every shudder that racked her frame. He wrapped an arm over her, pulling her tighter against him, trying to transfer his warmth to her. "I am cold," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "I know," he murmured against her hair. "I know. It will pass. Just breathe." Gradually, the shivering subsided. The heat of their bodies created a small, safe pocket of air beneath the canvas. Mara drifted into a restless sleep, her breathing evening out. Wyatt lay awake. He stared at the darkness, listening to the wind hiss through the sagebrush. He was acutely aware of the woman in his arms. He could smell the dust in her hair, the faint, metallic scent of fear that clung to her. He could feel the curve of her hip, the sharpness of her shoulder blades. A heat curled low in his belly, ancient and undeniable, but he crushed it down with a ruthless will. He thought of Harlan's hand on her wrist. He thought of the way men in the bunkhouse talked about women, as if they were livestock to be broken and used. He would not be that man. He shifted slightly, giving her more room, though there was none to give. His heart was thundering against his ribs, a heavy, driving rhythm. Mara stirred. She shifted in her sleep, pressing closer to him, seeking the source of the warmth. Her hand came up and rested on his forearm, her fingers curling into his shirt. Wyatt froze. He stopped breathing for a moment. He felt the weight of her trust, heavy and terrifying. She was sleeping in the arms of a man she barely knew, a man who worked for her tormentor, because she had no other choice. He rested his chin lightly on the top of her head. "I have got you," he whispered into the dark, a promise to himself as much as to her. "I will not let them take you, and I will not take from you." He forced his hands to stay still, his fingers spread flat on the blanket, refusing to caress, refusing to encroach. He watched the stars wheel overhead, keeping vigil over her sleep, until the gray light of pre-dawn warned him it was time to move. 2 days later, they crested a ridge and looked down upon the junction town. It was an ugly scar on the land. It had no name that anyone used, simply the junction. It was a place where the east-west rail line met a spur that ran down into the cattle country. It was a town built of raw lumber and desperation. Smoke from 2 locomotives chugged into the sky, thick, black, and greasy, mixing with the smell of thousands of cattle waiting in holding pens. The wind carried the scent of coal smoke, cow manure, unwashed men, and stale beer. The main street was a mire of churned mud. Despite the dry weather, men and wagons moved through it like insects in molasses. There were saloons on every corner, their signs faded and peeling. A boarding house stood near the tracks, a 2-story structure that looked as if it were holding itself together by sheer force of will. "It is not much," Wyatt said, reining in the horse. "It is not his ranch," Mara said. Her voice was hoarse, her lips cracked and bleeding, but her eyes were clear. They rode down into the town. People stared. A cowboy on a tired horse with a woman in a torn dress riding behind him was not an uncommon sight, but it was one that drew eyes. The gazes were not kind. Men assessed Mara with open speculation. Women on the boardwalk gathered their skirts and turned away. They pulled up in front of the boarding house. A sign swung above the door. Rooms, meals, baths. Wyatt dismounted and helped Mara down. She stood unsteadily, smoothing her ruined dress. She felt the weight of the town's judgment pressing on her, a physical weight like the canteen. "Stay close to me," Wyatt said. They walked inside. The lobby was dark, smelling of cabbage and lye. A woman stood behind a high desk. She was severe, with hair pulled back so tight it pulled her eyebrows up, and a mouth that looked like it had never tasted sugar. "We need a room," Wyatt said. "2 rooms, if you have them." The woman looked at Wyatt. Then her gaze slid to Mara. She took in the bruised cheek, the men's boots, the filthy dress. Her lip curled. "We run a respectable house," the woman said. "We do not rent to soiled doves." Mara flinched. The insult was sharp and practiced. "She is not a whore," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to that dangerous, gravelly timbre. "She is my sister. We have been traveling from the territories. We were set upon by bandits." The lie was thin, and the woman knew it. She looked at Wyatt's gun belt, tied low on his thigh. She looked at the coin he placed on the counter. It was a silver dollar, more than the room was worth. Greed warred with propriety in her eyes. Greed won. "1 room," the woman snapped. "The attic, $2 a week, in advance. No guests, no noise. And she gestured at Mara, "uses the back stairs. I do not want her frightening the paying guests." Wyatt's jaw tightened, but Mara touched his arm. "It is fine," she whispered. "Take it." Wyatt pushed another dollar across the counter. The weeks that followed were a grinding blur of labor. The town did not welcome them. It tolerated them. Wyatt found work quickly. He was a good hand, quiet and capable. He signed on with a rancher named Grady, who ran a spread 10 miles out of town. He rode out before dawn and came back after dark, smelling of horse sweat and cattle dip. Mara's battle was different. She had no skills that the town valued. Other than the strength of her back, the landlady, Mrs. Gable, allowed her to work off part of the rent by cleaning. Mara scrubbed floors until her knees were bruised blue. She washed linens in boiling vats of water, her hands turning red and raw, the skin peeling away in strips. She hauled wood for the stove and emptied chamber pots that smelled of sickness and whiskey. She learned to walk with her head down. The other boarders, railroad men, clerks, traveling salesmen, whispered when she passed, "That is the one," they would say. "Runaway. Heard she belonged to a cattleman down south." Trouble follows a girl like that. The women were worse. They pulled their children close when Mara walked by, as if her misfortune was a contagion. Trash, their eyes said. Used goods. Mara bore it. She bore it because she was free. Every time she emptied a pot or scrubbed a stain, she repeated it to herself. "I am not owned. I am not owned." Late one evening, 6 weeks after they had arrived, the boarding house was quiet. Outside, the rain was falling, turning the street into a river of sludge. Mara was in the kitchen, sitting at a small table in the corner, peeling potatoes for the next day's stew. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers. The back door opened, and Wyatt stepped in. He was soaked, water dripping from the brim of his hat. He looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed, his shoulders slumped. He hung his hat on a peg and walked to the stove, warming his hands. "There is stew left," Mara said softly, "and coffee." Wyatt turned. He looked at her, really looked at her. She was thin. Her dress was still the same mended calico, and her hands were rougher than a man's, but the bruise on her cheek had faded, and there was a steel in her spine that had not been there before. "Thank you," he said. He sat across from her. She pushed a bowl toward him and a tin cup of coffee. He ate hungrily, tearing off chunks of bread to wipe the bowl clean. They ate in silence, the rain drumming on the roof. It was a companionable silence, forged in the crucible of their escape. "How was the herd?" Mara asked eventually. "Skittish," Wyatt said. "The storm has them bunched up in the canyon. We lost a calf to a cougar. I'm sorry," she said. Wyatt shrugged. "It happens. It is honest work." He looked at her hands, busy with the knife and the potato. "How is Mrs. Gable today?" "She is herself," Mara said, a small, wry smile touching her lips. "She thinks I use too much soap. She says cleanliness is next to godliness. But soap costs a nickel a bar." Wyatt chuckled. It was a rusty sound, as if he hadn't used it in years. They fell silent again. The candle between them flickered. Mara put down the knife. "Wyatt," she said. He looked up. "Yeah, I never said it properly. Thank you." He frowned, looking down at his coffee. "You do not have to thank me." "I do," she insisted. "You could have left me. You could have let him take me back. You gave up your job. You gave up your life there. Why?" Wyatt turned the tin cup in his hands. He traced the rim with his thumb. "I watched him take you," he said quietly. "I watched your father sign that paper, and I felt sick. I have done a lot of things I am not proud of. Mara, I have looked the other way plenty of times, but when I saw you in that wagon, looking back at that house," he looked up, meeting her eyes. His gaze was intense, stripping away the layers of pretense. "I just couldn't be another man who did nothing," he said. Mara felt a lump in her throat. She reached for her own cup of coffee at the same moment Wyatt reached for the pot to refill his. Their hands met. His fingers, calloused and rough, brushed against hers, which were red and chapped. Mara froze. A shock went through her, sharp and sudden as static electricity. It wasn't just the touch. It was the heat. It was the sudden, overwhelming awareness of him as a man, not just a savior. She looked at his hand covering hers. She did not pull away. She felt a pull in her chest, a strange, terrifying gravity. It scared her. She had learned that men were dangerous, that they took what they wanted, but this man, his hand was shaking slightly. She looked up at his face. Wyatt was staring at their hands. His breath caught in his throat. He looked at her, and the tired slate of his eyes seemed to crack, revealing a burning, desperate hunger underneath. But he did not grab. He did not squeeze. He waited. Mara felt the fear, the ghost of Harlan's grip. But beneath it, she felt something else, a steadying warmth, a recognition. She slowly turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his for just a second. It was a tentative, fragile gesture. Then she pulled back, her heart hammering. I should finish the potatoes?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Wyatt pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. He cleared his throat, looking away toward the stove. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "Yeah, I should. I have to check the horses." He stood up abruptly, grabbing his hat. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "Good night, Mara. Good night, Wyatt." He went out into the rain. Mara sat alone in the kitchen, staring at her hand, feeling the ghost of his touch tingling on her skin. She felt terrified. She felt alive. And for the first time since she left the cabin, she felt something that wasn't anger. It was hope, and it was the most dangerous thing of all. Time did not pass in the junction so much as it eroded. wearing down the days like water grinding against stone. 2 years slipped by, marked not by calendars but by the brutal rotation of the seasons. The summers were a white-hot anvil, the sun hammering the earth until the mud turned to brick and the air shimmered with heat haze that distorted the horizon. Dust storms rolled in from the plains, towering walls of brown grit that swallowed the town whole, seeping through window cracks and coating every surface in a fine, silty powder that tasted of copper and ancient earth. Then came the winters, sweeping down from the northern peaks with knives in their fists. The wind screamed through the gaps in the boarding house walls, freezing the water in the wash basins and turning the cattle in the holding pens into huddled, shivering mounds of misery. Mara survived. She did more than survive. She hardened. The girl who had been dragged screaming from her father's cabin had vanished, replaced by a woman forged in the fires of labor and silence. Her body, once soft with youth, was now lean and roped with muscle. Her hands were rough, the skin permanently stained by lye soap and coal dust. Her fingernails cut short to keep them from breaking while she scrubbed the pine floors of Mrs. Gable's boarding house. She took in mending on the side, sitting by the dying light of the kitchen stove late into the night, stitching tears in cowboys' shirts and darning woolen socks until her eyes burned. She learned to walk through the town with a gaze that looked at everything and saw nothing. She carried herself with a quiet defiance, a stiffness in her spine that acted as a shield. When she walked down the boardwalk to the general store to buy thread or flour, she moved with a purpose that discouraged idle conversation. She wore her hair pulled back severe and tight, hiding her face as much as possible. But she could not hide who she was, or rather, who the town decided she was. The junction was a place of transience, but it had a long memory for scandal. The story of her arrival, riding behind Wyatt, bruised and bedraggled, had mutated and festered in the saloons and sewing circles. The truth was too complex for the small minds of the town, so they invented a simpler one. They whispered that she was Harlan Pike's cast-off, a woman who had been used up and thrown away. Or worse, a woman who had run off with a hired hand after stealing from her master. She is trouble, the matrons whispered behind their fans at the mercantile. Damaged goods. A woman like that has no shame. The men were cruder. They watched her with eyes that stripped her bare. That is Pike's leavings. They would mutter as she passed the saloon doors. Reckon she knows a trick or two? These whispers did not leave bruises, but they stung like salt in a paper cut. They reinforced the cage she had built around herself. She felt the weight of her father's betrayal every time a man looked at her with that speculative gleam. She felt the shame of the sale, the transaction that had reduced her humanity to a line item in a ledger. Wyatt heard the whispers too. He had grown leaner in 2 years, the boyish softness completely gone from his face, replaced by the weathering of a man who spent 18 hours a day in the saddle. He worked for a rancher named Grady, riding the perimeter, branding calves, and pulling heifers out of mud bogs. He was tired, always tired, but his eyes were sharp. He hated the town. He hated the way the shopkeeper counted Mara's coins twice, as if they might be counterfeit. He hated the way the boarders at the house fell silent when she entered the room, their eyes tracking her movements. More than once, the simmering rage he carried found a vent. One sweltering July evening, Wyatt stood at the bar of the Lucky Spur, nursing a warm beer. A group of drifters were playing faro at a nearby table, their voices loud and lubricated with cheap whiskey. "Nice filly over at the Gable place," one man said, a heavy-set drover with a wandering eye, dark hair. "Looks like she needs breaking." "Careful," another laughed. "I heard she belonged to Harlan Pike. You do not ride another man's horse, and you do not touch a rich man's whore." Wyatt set his glass down. The sound was soft, but the silence that followed in his immediate vicinity was absolute. He turned slowly. "You have something to say?" Wyatt asked, his voice low and level, like a calm river running over deep, dangerous holes. The drover looked up, blinking. "Just talk. Friend. No offense meant. Keep her name out of your mouth," Wyatt said. The drover sneered, emboldened by the whiskey. "Or what?" She is public property, ain't she? Everyone knows she was traded for—" The sentence ended in a wet crunch. Wyatt moved with the sudden violence of a rattlesnake strike. His fist connected with the man's mouth, sending him tipping backward in his chair, crashing into the table behind him. Cards and poker chips scattered across the floor. The drover scrambled up, spitting blood, reaching for the knife at his belt. Wyatt stepped inside the man's guard, driving a knee into his stomach and bringing a heavy fist down on the back of his neck. The man hit the floor and stayed there. Wyatt stood over him, breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding. He looked around the room, challenging anyone else to speak. "She is not public property," Wyatt snarled. "And she is not a whore." The bartender, a man named Silas, who had seen enough fights to know when one was finished, slammed a bung starter on the bar. "That is enough. Wyatt, get out. Take your temper with you." Wyatt threw a coin on the bar and walked out into the night, his hand throbbing, his heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and despair. He was building a reputation he did not want. A man with a hair-trigger temper, a man obsessed with the boarding house girl, but he could not stop himself. Every insult to her felt like a failure on his part, a reminder that he had saved her from the fire only to bring her into the smoke. There were moments of peace. However, stolen fragments of time that kept them both from shattering. On Sunday evenings, when the work slowed, they would sit on the back porch of the boarding house as the sun went down. The air would turn blue and purple, and the heat would lift from the ground in shimmering waves. Or they would walk down to the river, a muddy ribbon of water lined with cottonwoods that offered the only real shade for miles. It was here, away from the prying eyes of the town, that they dared to speak of the future. "I saw a parcel of land today," Wyatt said one evening, skipping a flat stone across the slow-moving water. "Up north, near the basin. Good grass, water rights." Mara sat on a fallen log, her hands resting in her lap. "How much?" "Too much," Wyatt admitted, "but not impossible. If I save for another 3 years, maybe. 3 years is a long time," Mara said softly. "It is." Wyatt agreed, "but it is something to aim for. A man needs something to aim for. I want to run my own herd. Mara, just 50 head, maybe 100. Cattle that carry my brand, not Grady's." Mara looked out at the water. "I want a house," she said. "Not a big one. Just a cabin with a solid roof, and a garden. A place where I can plant corn and it will not die. And a door with a lock that I hold the key to." "A lock," Wyatt repeated. He looked at her, understanding the weight of that word. "No one comes in unless you say so." "No one," she affirmed. She looked at him then. The setting sun caught the angles of his face, the scar on his chin, the way his dark hair curled over his collar. He was the only steady thing in her world, the only man who looked at her and saw Mara, not the debt, not the scandal. There was a rancher named Henderson, an older man with a sprawling operation on the edge of the territory. He had been watching Wyatt work for months, noting the young man's quiet competence and his way with horses. One Tuesday, Henderson rode up to where Wyatt was mending a fence line. He sat his horse easily, a man comfortable in his power. "You have got good hands, son," Henderson said. "I do my work," Wyatt replied, "tying off a piece of wire. I need a foreman for my north pasture." Henderson said, "It is rough country, heavy winters, but I need a man I can trust to manage the herd without me looking over his shoulder every day." Wyatt straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I have a job with Grady." "Grady pays you 30 a month in beans," Henderson said. "I will pay 40, and a percentage of the calf crop, if you do well. If the herd grows, I might be willing to lease you a section of that land in a few years. Let you run your own beef alongside mine." Wyatt felt a jolt in his chest. A lease, a percentage. It was the ladder out of the pit. He looked at Henderson. "Why me?" "Because I hear you are a man who stands his ground," Henderson said, "and a man who protects what he cares about. I like that in a foreman. Think on it." When Wyatt told Mara about the offer that night, sitting on the porch steps in the dark, her reaction was complex. "It is what you wanted," she said, her voice tight. "It is," Wyatt said. "It is a start. but it means moving. The north pasture is 10 miles out. There is a line shack there. It is rough. Mara, I am used to rough, she said. But it was not the hardship that gave her pause. It was the hope. Hope was terrifying. To hope for a future was to invite the universe to crush it again. And deeper than that, there was a gnawing guilt. She looked at Wyatt in the darkness. He stayed because of her. He fought for her. He was building a life that included her, though they had never spoken the words. And she wanted him. She felt it in the way her breath hitched when he walked into a room. She felt it in the ache that settled low in her stomach when she watched him wash up at the pump, water sluicing over his bare shoulders. She wanted his touch. She wanted the softness she had been denied. But every time the desire rose, the shame rose with it. Sold. The voice in her head whispered, "You were bought for whiskey. You are tainted." How could she offer herself to him? How could she let him love her when she felt so diminished? She was afraid that if she gave in to the desire, she would just be trading one form of dependency for another. She did not want to be kept. She wanted to be chosen, but she did not know if she was whole enough to choose back. The breaking point came in November. The first snow had dusted the ground, turning the mud of the main street into a treacherous slush. The boarding house was crowded with men waiting out the weather, out-of-work hands, a peddler selling patent medicines, and a few railroad surveyors. Dinner was a chaotic affair. Mara was serving stew, weaving between the crowded tables, her head down, trying to be invisible. A man sat at the end of the long table. He was a new arrival, a man with a greasy coat and eyes that were too wet and too close together. He had been drinking from a flask all afternoon. As Mara passed him to collect an empty bowl, he reached out and clamped his hand around her wrist. "Well now," he slurred, his voice loud in the sudden lull of conversation. "If it ain't the little bird I heard about. Harlan Pike's leftover." Mara froze. The room went silent. She tugged at her arm, but his grip was tight. "Let go," she said, her voice shaking. "I hear you are good for a debt." The man laughed, looking around at his table-mates for approval. What does it cost for a smile? 2 bits, or maybe a bottle? The shame was a hot wave that crashed over her, suffocating and red. It was the saloon all over again. It was her father's voice. It was the wagon. Before she could speak, before she could scream, a blur of motion crossed the room. Wyatt had just walked in from the cold, stamping snow from his boots. He heard the words. He saw the hand on her wrist. He did not speak. He did not warn. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, grabbed the man by the back of his greasy coat, and ripped him out of the chair. The man howled as he was thrown backward, crashing into the wall. Wyatt was on him instantly. This was not a barroom scuffle. This was an execution of rage. Wyatt punched the man in the face, the sound of bone on bone sickeningly loud. "Do not touch her," Wyatt roared, striking him again. "Do not you ever touch her." The man was bloody and insensible within seconds, but Wyatt did not stop. He was hitting the past. He was hitting Harlan. He was hitting every whisper and every look that had ever hurt her. Wyatt. It took 3 men to pull him off. Grady's foreman and 2 railroad workers hauled Wyatt back, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and unseeing. The man on the floor groaned, clutching a broken nose. "Get him out of here, Mrs.!" Gable shrieked from the kitchen doorway. "Get him out before I call the marshal!" Wyatt shook off the hands holding him. He looked at Mara. She was standing by the table, clutching her wrist, her face pale as milk. She looked terrified, not of the man, but of the violence, of him. He turned and stormed up the stairs to his room, the door slamming behind him with a force that rattled the windows. An hour later, the house was quiet. The beaten man had been dragged out by his friends. The other boarders had retreated to their rooms, whispering excitedly about the fight. Mara stood outside Wyatt's door. She held a basin of warm water, a clean rag, and a small bottle of arnica. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knocked softly. "Go away." Wyatt's voice came from inside, thick and rough. "It is me," she said. A long silence. Then, the sound of a bolt sliding back. The door opened. Wyatt stood there in his undershirt, his hair disheveled. His right hand was a ruin, swollen, purple, the knuckles split wide open and oozing blood. "Let me see," she said quietly. He stepped back, allowing her to enter. The room was tiny, barely big enough for the narrow bed and a washstand. The ceiling slanted low under the eaves, making the space feel like a cave. A single lantern flickered on the crate he used as a table, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The wind rattled the window pane, a lonely, hollow sound. "Sit down," Mara said. Wyatt sat on the edge of the bed. He looked defeated. The rage had burned out, leaving only ash and shame. Mara dipped the rag in the warm water. She took his hand in hers. It was heavy and hot. She began to gently clean the blood from his knuckles. "You should not have done that," she whispered. "He was drunk. He called you." Wyatt's voice cracked. He could not finish the sentence. "I know what he called me," Mara said. "Words are just wind. Wyatt." "They are not," he said, looking up at her. His eyes were dark, tortured. "They are poison. I could not stand it. Mara, I could not watch him put his hands on you." Mara paused, the rag hovering over his skin. She felt the tremor in his hand. She looked at his face, the hard jaw, the mouth that was usually so grim now softened by pain and worry. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Why do you fight the whole world for me?" Wyatt swallowed. His throat worked. He looked at her hand holding his, the contrast of her pale fingers against his battered skin. "Because you are not what they say," he rasped. "Because you are the best thing in this God-forsaken world, and they treat you like dirt." He took a breath. The air in the small room suddenly charged, thick with the smell of arnica and rain and the musk of his skin. "I think about you, Mara, all the time, out in the range, when the wind is blowing. I think about you safe in here. I worry about you." He looked into her eyes, and the honesty there was terrifying. "I want more than this," he admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I am tired of being your friend. I am tired of sleeping in this room alone, wishing I was holding you." Mara's breath hitched. Her first instinct was to pull away, the old fear rearing up, the fear of the trap, the fear of the debt. "He wants to own you," the fear whispered. But she looked at him. This was Wyatt. This was the man who had left water in the desert. The man who had slept beside her for weeks without touching her because he knew she was afraid. The man who had just bloodied his hands to defend her honor. He was not Harlan. The realization broke something open inside her chest, a dam bursting. The guilt, the shame, the fear, it all washed away for a singular moment, replaced by a desperate, aching need. "Wyatt." She breathed. He saw the change in her eyes. He saw the wall come down. He reached out with his uninjured hand and cupped her face. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, rough but impossibly gentle. Mara leaned into his touch. She closed her eyes and let out a shuddering sigh. Then he leaned forward, and she met him. The kiss was slow. It was not the crushing, taking kiss she had feared from men. It was tentative, a question asked and answered. His lips were warm, tasting of salt and coffee. Mara made a small sound in her throat. She dropped the rag. Her hands came up to clutch the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened. It grew hungry. It was the release of 2 years of silence. 2 years of standing on opposite sides of a line they were afraid to cross. Wyatt groaned low in his chest, his hand sliding from her face to her waist, his fingers spreading carefully, holding her as if she were made of glass. Their breath mingled, hot and fast. Mara felt a fire ignite in her belly, a sensation she had never known, a fierce, demanding heat that made her press her body against his. She felt the hardness of his chest, the strength of his legs against hers. For a moment, she forgot the boarding house. She forgot the debt. She forgot everything but the taste of him and the thunder of his heart against her own. Then, the memory of the hand on her wrist, the boarder's hand, Harlan's hand, flashed in her mind. Panic flared. She pulled back, gasping. her eyes wide. She scrambled backward a step, her hand flying to her mouth. "No," she whispered. I can't." Wyatt stopped instantly. He did not chase her. He stayed seated on the bed, his chest heaving, his eyes black with desire, but his hands held up, palms open. "Mara," he said, his voice rough. "I am not ready," she stammered, tears pricking her eyes. I cannot belong to anyone again. Wyatt, I cannot be owned, not even by you." Wyatt looked at her. He saw the terror warring with the want. He stood up slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves. He took a step toward her, but stopped when she flinched. "Listen to me," he said. His voice was low, shaking with the effort of control. "You do not belong to me. You never will. I do not want to own you. Mara." He reached out, not to touch her, but to offer his hand. "I do not want to be your master," he said fiercely. "I just want to stand beside you. I want to be the man who stands between you and the wind. That is all. If you will let me—" Mara looked at his hand. She looked at his face, stripped of all artifice. She saw the truth there. He was offering a partnership, not a collar. She let out a long, shaky breath. She did not take his hand. Not yet. She was not ready to cross that final distance. But the panic receded, leaving a trembling quiet in the room. "I believe you," she whispered. She stepped back toward the door. I should go. Mrs. Gable will wonder." Wyatt nodded. He lowered his hand. "Good night. Mara, good night." She slipped out of the room, closing the door softly between them. She walked down the hall to her own small room, her lips still burning, her heart racing. She lay in her bed, staring at the dark ceiling. She did not sleep for a long time. Something had shifted. The air between them was no longer empty. It was charged with a new current. They were not lovers. Not yet. She had drawn a line, and he had respected it. But as she touched her fingers to her lips, tracing the ghost of his kiss, she knew that the line was no longer a wall. It was a threshold, and for the first time in her life, she was standing on the edge of it, looking not at a cage, but at a horizon. Beneath the daily struggle of floor scrub and cattle dust, a deep, growing desire had taken root, and even the winter wind could not freeze it out. The wind on the high plains of the territory was different from the wind in the red rock canyons. Here, it was a constant, keening presence that stripped the moisture from the soil and tested the joints of every living thing. It was a place of thin, rocky earth and erratic rain, a landscape that seemed to resent the intrusion of the plow and the fence post, but it was theirs. 5 years had passed since Mara and Wyatt had ridden out of the junction town, leaving behind the boarding house and the whispers. They were in their mid-20s now, the softness of youth fully eroded by the grit of the frontier. They had leased a section of land outside of a small, unnamed settlement that was little more than a post office and a mercantile, miles from the railhead. It was a hard patch of ground, prone to early frosts and blistering summers. But the deed of lease held Wyatt's name, and the cabin that sat upon it was built with logs they had felled and notched together with their own hands. The cabin was not much to look at. The roof leaked when the spring thaws came, requiring buckets to be set out in a grim constellation across the floorboards. The wind whistled through chinking that needed constant repair, but inside, there was a cast-iron stove that threw out a fierce heat, a table scrubbed white with sand, and a single bed in the corner that had become the center of their world. They had never spoken a vow before a preacher. There had been no ring, no ceremony, no paper signed to satisfy the law or the neighbors. The transition from two people surviving together to two people living as one had been as gradual and inevitable as the turning of the seasons. It had started with the cold, a particularly brutal winter 3 years back when the firewood ran low and the temperature dropped until the nails in the walls popped with the frost. They had huddled together for warmth, fully clothed, back to chest. Then, the clothes had become fewer, the touches had become lingering, the need for warmth had transformed into a need for skin, for the reassurance of a heartbeat against a palm, for the silent language of breath and friction. Now, on a night deep in November, The wind was howling around the eaves, batting at the heavy wooden door. Inside, the fire was banked low. Mara lay awake, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling logs. Wyatt was asleep beside her, his arm thrown heavy and possessive over her waist. His breathing was a slow, steady rhythm that usually lulled her to sleep. But tonight, the darkness felt thick. She shifted, the corn shuck mattress rustling beneath her. Wyatt mumbled something unintelligible and pulled her closer, his face burying itself in the crook of her neck. His beard scratched her skin, a sensation that was rough and familiar and grounding. She placed her hand over his arm, feeling the solid muscle, the scars on his knuckles. This was their life. It was a hard life. They lost 3 calves last winter to a blizzard that buried the draws in 6 feet of snow. They had fought off a prairie fire that nearly took the barn in August. They worked from the moment the sky turned gray until it turned black again. But no one owned them. No one told Mara where to stand or what she was worth. Yet, sleep would not come. When she finally drifted off, the dream was waiting. It was always the same. The smell of stale whiskey and old sweat, the scratch of a pen on paper. Her father's face, not as it was when he was kind, but as it was in the saloon, yellow-eyed, weak, looking at the bottle instead of her. Then the scene would shift, and Harlan Pike would be there, looming over her, his hand clamping on her wrist, his voice smooth as oil, telling her that debts never truly died. "You are mine," the dream, Harlan whispered. "A sale is a sale." Mara woke with a gasp. Sitting bolt upright in the bed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was sweating despite the cold of the room. Wyatt was awake instantly. He did not ask what was wrong. He knew. He sat up and wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. "I am here," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "You are here. The door is barred." Mara trembled, her hands gripping his forearms until her nails dug in. "I could smell the whiskey," she whispered. "There is no whiskey here," Wyatt said firmly. "Only pine wood and sage. Breathe, Mara." He held her while she shook, rocking her slightly. He pressed a kiss to her temple, then to her shoulder. He was her anchor. He was the only thing that kept her from drifting back into that dark room in her memory. It was not the first time she had woken this way, and she knew it would not be the last. The past was a ghost that refused to be exorcised by distance or time. 2 days later, the ghost gained a voice. The afternoon was cold and bright, the sky a piercing blue that hurt the eyes. Wyatt was out in the south pasture, mending a break in the fence where a spooked herd of antelope had gone through. Mara was in the yard, chopping kindling for the stove, the axe rising and falling with a rhythmic thwack. She heard the horse before she saw it. She stopped, the axe resting on the chopping block, and wiped her brow with the back of her hand. A rider was approaching from the east road, a man hunched in a sheepskin coat on a roan gelding that looked ridden hard. Mara reached for the rifle she kept leaned against the porch rail. She did not aim it, but she held it across her body, a signal that she was not a woman to be trifled with. The rider slowed and raised a hand in greeting. He was an older man, his face a map of wrinkles and windburn, tobacco juice staining his white beard. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called out. "Just passing through to the high country. Wondered if I could water my horse at your trough." Mara looked him over. He looked tired, not dangerous. "The trough is full," she said, lowering the rifle slightly. "Help yourself. There is coffee on the stove if you have a mind for it." The man smiled, revealing gaps in his teeth. That would be a kindness. "Ma'am, name is Caleb." He watered his horse and followed Mara to the porch. She poured him a tin cup of black coffee. He blew on the steam, looking out over their modest spread. "You and your man have done good work here," Caleb said. "Hard ground. It yields if you push it," Mara said. Caleb nodded. "I just came up from the south, Pike's Basin. You know it?" Mara felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the wind. She kept her face impassive. "I have heard of it." Nasty business down there, Caleb said, taking a loud sip of coffee. Place is booming, though that man Pike, he owns the whole valley now. Bought out the smallholders, squeezed out the rest. He is running 5,000 head of cattle. Mara's fingers tightened on her own cup. 5,000? Aye, and he runs the town. 2. Got a mayor in his pocket and a sheriff on his payroll. Caleb shook his head, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. It is a sin. What is happening? I saw families packed into wagons, heading west because they could not pay the new taxes Pike pushed through. And the debts, Lord, the debts. What about the debts? Mara asked, her voice tight. Caleb looked at her, sensing the intensity in her question. Same old story. Ma'am, men drink away their hope at Pike's saloon, then sign away their land or their labor, and worse. Worse. Caleb lowered his voice, though there was no one for miles to hear. I heard talk. Girls. Daughters of men who owed too much. Working in the dance halls, or out at the big ranch. Working off the sins of their fathers. It is slavery, in all but name. If you ask me. Mara felt the blood drain from her face. The world tilted on its axis. And, is there a man named Elias there? She asked, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. Caleb scratched his chin. Elias. Old drunk? Sort of a errand boy for Pike? Yes. Aye, he is there, living in a shack behind the warehouse. They say he is Pike's favorite dog, signs the papers as a witness when Pike takes a man's land. A pathetic creature. Mara set her cup down on the railing. It rattled against the wood. Thank you for the news. Caleb, she said. Her voice was cold, distant. Caleb finished his coffee, sensing that the welcome had abruptly ended. He thanked her and mounted his horse. Riding off toward the mountains, Mara stood on the porch for a long time. She watched the dust settle in his wake, the rage that she had kept banked for 5 years, the rage that she had tried to bury under hard work and Wyatt's love, flared to life. It was not a flicker this time. It was a conflagration. When Wyatt returned at dusk, the cabin was dark. There was no supper on the stove. The fire had burned down to embers. He walked in, hanging his hat on the peg. Mara? She was sitting at the table, her hands clasped in front of her, staring at the wood grain. She did not look up. Wyatt sensed the tension immediately. The air in the room felt brittle, ready to snap. He walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. What happened? He asked. A man came by, she said, her voice flat. From home. Wyatt's hand stilled. He did not say anything. He waited. Harlan owns it all. Wyatt, she said, finally looking up. Her eyes were dry, but they burned with a terrifying intensity. The whole valley. He is taking land. He is buying laws. And he is taking girls. Wyatt pulled a chair out and sat opposite her. He rubbed his face with his hands, the dust of the day grinding into his skin. I figured he would, Wyatt said quietly. He is a greedy man. He is taking girls, Mara repeated, her voice rising. Just like he took me. And my father. He is helping him. He is witnessing the thefts. He is living off the scraps Harlan throws him while other families are destroyed. It is a bad business. Mara, is that all you have to say? She snapped. It is a bad business? Wyatt looked at her, his expression guarded. What do you want me to say? We knew who they were. That is why we left. We ran, she corrected. We did not leave. We ran away and hid here in the middle of nowhere while they got stronger. We survived, Wyatt said, his voice hardening. Look around you. Mara, we built this house. We have cattle in the pen. We are free. Are we? She demanded. She stood up, pacing the small room. How can we be free when I wake up screaming his name? How can I be free when I know there is another girl, right now, crying in that wagon, being driven to that ranch? Mara, Wyatt said, standing up to stop her pacing. Don't touch me, she said, pulling away. You want to pretend it does not exist? You want to bury your head in this dirt and pretend the rest of the world isn't burning? I want to live, Wyatt shouted, his control finally snapping. The sound of his voice filled the small cabin. He took a breath, lowering his tone but keeping the intensity. I want to live. Mara, I want to wake up in the morning and worry about the frost, not a bullet. I want to raise children who do not know what the inside of a saloon looks like. If we go back there, if we challenge him, he will kill us. He has the law. He has the money. So we let him win? Mara asked, her voice trembling with fury. We let him hurt people because we are scared? It is not about winning, Wyatt said. It is about surviving. You are letting the hate hollow you out. I see it. It eats at you. It takes the joy out of the morning. If you go back there, even if you kill him, the hate will finish the job on you. And you are a coward. She spat. The word hung in the air. Ugly and irrevocable. Wyatt flinched as if she had struck him. His face went pale beneath the tan. He looked at her with a profound hurt that silenced her instantly. I have done everything for you, he said, his voice quiet and deadly. I betrayed my employer. I beat men down for looking at you wrong. I have worked my fingers to the bone to give you a roof where you are safe. Call me what you want. Mara. But do not call me a coward for wanting to keep you breathing. He turned and walked to the bed. He sat down and pulled off his boots, throwing them into the corner with a heavy thud. He lay down, turning his back to the room. Mara stood by the cold stove. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. She felt sick. The word coward tasted like poison on her tongue. She knew it wasn't true. She knew he was the bravest man she had ever known, but the anger was a wild thing, thrashing inside her, blinding her. She blew out the lantern. She walked to the bed and lay down. She turned her back to him. They lay there, inches apart, separated by a chasm of unspoken fear and resentment. The wind rattled the window, mocking them. Neither of them slept. Morning came with a deceptive peace. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a scrubbed, brilliant blue. The mountains in the distance were etched sharply against the horizon, capped with new snow. The cabin was cold. The fire had gone out completely. Mara lay still, staring at the wall. She felt drained. The rage of the night before settled into a heavy, cold ash in her stomach. She heard Wyatt shift. He sat up. The mattress creaked. He did not get up to start the fire. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. I am scared, he said. His voice was rough, unhidden. He did not look at her. Mara rolled over slowly. She looked at the curve of his back, the tension in his shoulders. Wyatt? He turned his head slightly. I am scared. Mara, not of Harlan, not of dying. Really, I am scared of losing you. He looked at the floorboards. When I took you from that wagon, I made a promise to myself that I would never let anyone hurt you again. If we go back there, I cannot guarantee that, and the thought of watching you walk back into that hell, it freezes my blood. He looked at her then, his eyes red-rimmed and honest. I love you, he said. It was the first time he had said the words out loud. They hung in the cold air, fragile and powerful. I love you more than I want justice. I love you more than I hate him. That is the truth. If that makes me a coward, then I reckon I am one. Mara felt tears prick her eyes, hot and stinging. The wall of anger she had built crumbled. She sat up, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. You are not a coward, she whispered. I am sorry. I should not have said that. She moved closer to him, reaching out to touch his arm. I am terrified too. Wyatt, she admitted. I am scared that if we go back, we will never come out. But I am scared that if I do not go back, I will never really be here, she said. I am scared that a part of me is still in that wagon. That anger, it is the only way I know how to not feel powerless. I used it to survive, but you are right. It is eating me. Running hasn't freed me. It just made the cage bigger. Wyatt looked at her. He saw the woman he had watched grow from a broken girl into a force of nature. He saw the scars on her heart, and he knew, with a sinking certainty, that she could not be healed by safety alone. He turned his body toward her. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I do not want you to be powerless, he said. Mara leaned into his hand. She closed her eyes, a tear tracking through the dust on her cheek. She lunged forward then, wrapping her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. It was a desperate embrace, rough-edged and fierce. She held on to him as if the earth were falling away beneath them. Wyatt caught her, his arms going around her waist, pulling her tight against him. "I am sorry," she sobbed into his shirt. "I am so sorry." He held her, stroking her hair. "Hush now. It is all right." She pulled back slightly, looking at his face. She kissed him. It was not gentle. It was a collision. It was a kiss that tasted of apology and promise, of fear and defiance. She kissed him with a hunger that sought to erase the distance of the night before, to bridge the gap between their souls. Wyatt responded instantly, his hands tangling in her hair, his mouth moving against hers with an urgency that matched her own. They fell back onto the mattress, the quilt tangling around their legs. This was not the slow, comfortable lovemaking of the last few years. This was a claiming. It was a reaffirmation of life in the face of the death they were discussing. It was Mara proving to herself and to him that this bond, this man, this moment was real, and the past was just a shadow. Later, the sun was high enough to stream through the window, warming the dust motes dancing in the air. They lay tangled together beneath the worn quilt, limbs heavy with exhaustion and peace. Mara rested her head on Wyatt's chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart. She traced the line of a scar on his shoulder with her fingertip. "We have to go," she whispered. The words were soft, but they were as solid as the foundation stones of the cabin. Wyatt did not flinch this time. He stared up at the ceiling logs. "I know," he said. "I cannot live with myself if I leave them there." Mara said, "I cannot be the woman who escaped and left the door locked behind her. And I have to face him, my father. I have to look him in the eye without fear." Wyatt tightened his arm around her. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cold air of the house they had built. He thought of the cattle in the pen. He thought of the peace he had found here. And then he thought of Mara, alone in a wagon, facing a monster. He knew he could not stay here while she went into the fire. There was no life for him in this cabin without her. "If you go," he said, his voice steady and final, "then I go too." Mara propped herself up on one elbow. "You do not have to. You could stay. Keep the land." "No," Wyatt said. He looked at her, his slate-gray eyes clear and resolved. "There is no land for me without you, Mara. Wherever you choose to stand, that is where I belong. We ride together." Mara looked at him, and her heart swelled with a love so painful and sweet it made her breath catch. She nodded slowly. "Together," she said. Wyatt sat up. He swung his legs out of bed and reached for his trousers. "Then we best get started," he said. "We have cattle to sell. We need supplies. And we need ammunition." Mara watched him stand up, the sunlight outlining his form. She felt a cold shiver of anticipation, but the crushing weight of helplessness was gone. She was not a victim anymore. She was a woman with a rifle, a horse, and a man who would burn the world down for her. She threw off the quilt and stood up to meet the day. The wind was still blowing outside, but she no longer feared it. She was the storm now. The morning they left the high plains was cold enough to freeze the breath in a man's throat. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, heavy and low, pressing down on the cabin that Mara and Wyatt had built with their own hands. They had spent the previous 2 days preparing. It was a somber, efficient process, stripping their lives down to what could be carried in saddlebags and a single pack mule. They drove 20 head of their best steers over the ridge to the neighboring spread, a rocky parcel of land worked by an old man named Silas Miller. Miller was a man of few words and deep lines, his face weathered like a piece of driftwood. He counted the cattle, his eyes narrowing against the wind, and handed Wyatt a pouch of gold coins and a stack of greenbacks. "It is a fair price," Miller said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the frozen dirt. "You are leaving the rest?" "We are leaving them in your care," Wyatt said. "If we are not back by the first snow of next year, they are yours. Consider it payment for the feed." Miller looked from Wyatt to Mara. He saw the rifles scabbarded on their saddles. He saw the set of their jaws. He did not ask where they were going or why. In this country, men did not ask questions that had no easy answers. "You ride safe," Miller said simply. "The wind is changing." They turned their horses away from the only peace they had ever known. Mara did not look back at the cabin. She kept her eyes fixed on the ears of her horse, afraid that if she looked at the smoke curling from the chimney one last time, her resolve would shatter like ice under a hammer. The journey south was a descent into memory. They rode through country that grew increasingly arid and hostile. They navigated wind-carved canyons where the red rock walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, twisting and turning like the corridors of a nightmare. The wind here did not just blow. It screamed, funneling through the narrows with a sound like a dying animal. They crossed wide stretches of prairie where the grass was brittle and yellow. Along the way, they passed the skeletons of dreams that had failed. A chimney standing alone in a field of sagebrush, black with soot. The rusted iron rim of a wagon wheel half buried in the sand. Deep, hardened ruts in the earth where families had dragged their hopes westward, only to break an axle or a heart and leave them there to rot. As the days wore on, Mara grew quieter. She had been a woman of few words on their own land, but this was a different silence. It was a heavy, brooding thing. Her eyes lost their softness, fixing on the southern horizon with a terrifying intensity. Her jaw was perpetually clenched, a muscle jumping in her cheek. Wyatt rode beside her, watching her. He saw the way her hands tightened on the leather reins until her knuckles turned white. He saw the way she scanned every ridge, not for game, but for threats. On the fourth day, as the sun began to dip toward the jagged line of the mountains, Wyatt spurred his horse closer. He reached across the gap between their saddles. He did not speak. He simply covered her white-knuckled hand with his own. Mara started looking at him. Her eyes were wide, the pupils dilated with adrenaline. For a moment, she looked like she did not know him. Then, the recognition flooded back, softening the hard lines around her mouth. She turned her hand over, linking her fingers with his. They rode like that for a mile, their horses matching stride, hands clasped over the dusty gap between them. It was a tether. It was a reminder that they were two, not one. The town had a name, but to Mara, it had always just been the place. Now, as they crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley, it looked like a festering wound on the landscape. It had changed in 5 years. Where there had once been a loose collection of clapboard shacks and tents, there was now a sprawling settlement. New buildings of raw lumber lined the main street. A massive warehouse sat near the creek, storing grain and whiskey, and dominating it all. Standing 2 stories tall with a fresh coat of paint and a balcony that looked down on the street like a throne, was the saloon. The sign above the door was large, painted in gold letters that caught the dying sun. Pike's Palace. Harlan's name was not just on the saloon. It was on the livery stable. It was on the general store. It was branded into the hides of the cattle grazing in the valley floor. They rode down the main street at a walk. The dust was thick, smelling of manure and coal smoke. The town felt heavy, oppressive. People stopped to watch them pass. Men leaning against posts straightened up, their eyes tracking the rifles and the pack mule. Women in faded calico dresses hurried their children inside, casting fearful glances over their shoulders. Old-timers, men Mara vaguely remembered from her childhood, squinted at her through the grit. She saw recognition dawn in a few pairs of watery eyes. A widening, a sudden intake of breath. They looked at her as if they were seeing a ghost, or something worse, a reckoning. Mara held her head high. She let them look. She was not the girl in the wagon anymore. She wore a man's duster coat and a flat-brimmed hat. She wore a revolver on her hip, the leather of the holster worn smooth. They stabled their horses at a livery that was not owned by Harlan, a rundown structure at the edge of town run by a man with one arm. They paid in coin, asking for a private stall and fresh hay. "Where are we going?" Wyatt asked as they stepped back out into the glare. "The graveyard," Mara said. It was a small plot of land on a rise overlooking the creek, fenced in by rotting posts and barbed wire. It was choked with weeds and tumbleweeds. Mara opened the gate. The hinges shrieked in protest. She walked past the newer graves, marked with wooden crosses, to a small depression near a twisted juniper tree. The marker was simple, a piece of slate carved by Elias years ago, before the drink took his hands. Sarah. Mara knelt in the brittle grass. She did not pray. She simply touched the cold stone. Memories of her mother were faint now, a smell of dried lavender, a soft hum while kneading dough. But the loss was as sharp as ever. Her mother had died of a fever when Mara was 10, leaving her alone with Elias. If Sarah had lived, none of this would have happened. Sarah would have stood between Elias and the bottle. Sarah would have shot Harlan Pike before she let him take her daughter. Wyatt stood back by the gate, his hat in his hand. He watched the town below, his body angled to protect her, giving her the space she needed to mourn the only pure thing she had left in this valley. Mara stayed there until the sun touched the mountains. Tears dragged hot, clean lines down her dust-streaked cheeks, falling into the thirsty earth. She wiped them away with a rough swipe of her glove. "Goodbye, Mama," she whispered. "I am back, and I am going to finish it." She stood up, her knees cracking. She turned to Wyatt. "Let's find him," she said. It did not take long to locate Elias. In a town this size, misery had a specific address. They asked the one-armed liveryman, who spat and pointed toward the back of the massive saloon. "He lives in the shack behind the warehouse," the man said. "If you can call it living. He sweeps the floors for Pike, mucks the stables. Mostly just drinks himself blind." Mara felt a sick twist in her gut. It was a knot composed of equal parts anger and pity. She walked toward the alley behind the saloon, her boots crunching on broken glass and refuse. Wyatt walked a step behind her, his hand resting near his gun. The shack was a lean-to built against the back wall of the warehouse. It was constructed of scrap wood and flattened tin cans. The door hung on leather hinges. Mara pushed it open. The smell hit her first, a fetid wall of stale whiskey, unwashed body, and rot. It was dark inside, lit only by the slivers of light coming through the cracks in the walls. A figure lay on a pile of filthy blankets in the corner. "Elias?" Mara said. The figure stirred. A groan rumbled from the blankets. A man sat up, rubbing his face with trembling hands. He was unrecognizable. The man Mara remembered had been thin and hard. This man was bloated, his face puffy and red, his belly soft. His hair was a matted gray mane, and his beard was stained yellow with tobacco and bile. "Who is it?" he rasped. "I swept the floor. Harlan, I did it. Do not cut me off. It is not Harlan," Mara said. She stepped into the shaft of light. Elias squinted, his eyes watery and yellowed. He blinked, trying to focus. He looked at her boots, her gun belt, her face. "Mara," he whispered. It was a sound of pure disbelief. "Get up," she said. Elias scrambled backward, pressing himself against the wall. You are gone. You are gone to the ranch. I left the ranch 5 years ago. Pa, she said cold and hard." Elias shook his head. No, Harlan said. "He said you ran off. He said you were dead in the desert. He lied," Mara said. "Just like you lied when you said it was for the best." Elias struggled to his feet, using the wall for support. He looked at her with a mixture of shame and defensive anger. "I did not have a choice," he blurted out, the old excuse rising like vomit. "The debt was too high. Mara, he was going to take the land. He was going to put me in jail. So you sold me." Mara said, "You traded your own blood for a tab at the bar. I thought you would be safe." Elias cried. "A housekeeper." He said, "Good food, warm bed, better than starving with me." "You knew what he was." Mara spat. "Everyone knew what he was. You just did not want to face him. You wanted your bottle more than you wanted your daughter." Elias looked down, unable to meet the fire in her eyes. "I am an old man. Mara, I am sick." "The luck never turned." "You made your own luck," she said. "Look at you. You are living in his garbage. You are his dog. I am surviving, Elias shouted, a flash of the old temper flaring. Who are you to judge me? You ran away. You left me here with him. I was 19 years old, Mara screamed back, her voice cracking. I was a child. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Elias's ragged breathing. You should not have come back, Elias mumbled, sinking back down onto his blankets. He owns this place. Mara, he owns the law. He will kill you. Let him try, Wyatt said from the doorway. Elias looked up, seeing the cowboy for the first time. He narrowed his eyes. I know you. You are one of his. Wyatt, I was. Wyatt said, now I'm with her. Elias laughed. A wet, hacking sound. Two fools. You think you can walk in here and change things? Harlan has a paper, a contract. A contract for a human being is no contract at all, Wyatt said. Just then, a shadow fell over the doorway. The light was blocked out. Well, a smooth voice said, if it is not the prodigal daughter. Mara spun around. Harlan Pike stood in the alley. He had aged well. His suit was fine wool, clean and pressed. His vest was silk. He wore a gold watch chain that glittered in the sun. He looked prosperous, powerful, and utterly unbothered. Two men stood behind him, big men with shotguns cradled in their arms. Harlan smiled. It was a smile that did not reach his eyes. His eyes were flat and dead, like a shark's. I heard a rumor you had returned, Harlan said, stepping into the shack, wrinkling his nose at the smell. And you brought my thief of a cowhand with you? Hello, Wyatt. Harlan, Wyatt said, his voice level. You look well, Mara, Harlan said, his eyes raking over her body, assessing her like a piece of livestock he had misplaced. A little rough around the edges, perhaps, but the years have given you texture. I am not your property. Harlan? Mara said, her hand hovering near her gun. Harlan chuckled. On the contrary, my dear, I have a bill of sale, signed by your father right there. He pointed a manicured finger at Elias, who cowered in the corner. You owe me 5 years of labor, plus interest, and the cost of the horse Wyatt stole? I owe you nothing but a bullet, Mara said. Harlan tutted. Such violence. You see, Wyatt, she needs a firm hand. Harlan took a step closer to Mara. His presence filled the small space. You made a mistake coming back, he said softly. I was content to let you rot in the desert. But now that you are here, well, I am a man who insists on balancing his books. You belong to me, Mara, and this time, there will be no open windows to crawl out of. Wyatt moved. It was a blur of motion. He stepped between Mara and Harlan, his chest heaving. His fists were curled so tight the knuckles were white. You touch her, Wyatt snarled, getting in Harlan's face, and I will tear your throat out with my teeth. Harlan did not flinch. He just looked past Wyatt's shoulder at the men with shotguns. Try it, cowboy, Harlan whispered. Give me an excuse to paint this shack with your brains. Wyatt's muscles coiled. He was ready to die right there. He was ready to end it. No, Mara hissed. She grabbed Wyatt's arm, her fingers digging into his bicep. Wyatt, no, not yet. She pulled him back. She knew they could not win this here, not in a shack, outnumbered, with Elias cowering in the corner. If Wyatt swung, they would both be dead in seconds. Harlan smiled, seeing her restraint. Smart girl. You always were brighter than your father. He straightened his cuffs. I will give you a day, Harlan said, to settle your affairs. Enjoy the town. Visit the grave. But tomorrow, Mara, you come to the saloon. You come to work, or I will have the sheriff arrest you for breach of contract and theft, and Wyatt. I will have him hanged for rustling. He turned and walked out, his boots clicking on the stones. His men followed, casting dark looks at Wyatt. The silence in the shack was deafening. Elias began to weep, a pathetic, snuffling sound. Mara looked at her father one last time. She felt nothing for him now. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only a cold, hard resolve. Stay here, Pa, she said. Stay in your filth." She took Wyatt's hand and led him out into the blinding sunlight. They took a room at the hotel down the street. It was a step above the boarding house they had lived in years ago. But the walls were still thin, and the air smelled of dust and lemon oil. They did not unpack. They checked their weapons. They counted their ammunition. "We have to talk to people," Mara said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "We cannot just kill him. Wyatt, if we kill him, the town will hang us. He has them all convinced he is the law. We have to show them what he is," Wyatt said. They spent the afternoon moving cautiously through the town. They avoided the saloon. They went to the general store, buying supplies they did not need just to talk to the shopkeeper. The man was nervous, glancing at the door every few seconds. "Is it true?" Mara asked him. "Does he have others?" The shopkeeper lowered his voice. "Mrs. Gable's girl, the Smith's youngest, debts. Ma'am, always debts. He gets the fathers drunk, gets them to sign, and then they disappear into that big house of his, or the dance hall upstairs. They went to the church. The preacher was a new man, young and terrified. He spoke in platitudes about rendering unto Caesar, but his eyes begged them to leave before he was seen talking to them. But it was at the livery stable that they found the truth. A woman was working there, mucking out the stalls with one arm, the other tucked into her apron. Her face was scarred. "Rosie?" Mara asked. The woman looked up. She was older than Mara, but her eyes were ancient. "You made it back," Rosie said softly. "I heard." Mara leaned over the stall door. "Harlan said he has a contract on me. He has contracts on half the town," Rosie said bitterly. She dropped her pitchfork. "My brother owed him for seed. Harlan took me, said it was for a month." "What happened?" Wyatt asked. "I was there 3 days. Rosie said he is a devil. My brother came back with a rifle. Told Harlan he would burn the ranch down if he did not let me go. Harlan laughed, but he let me go. Said I was damaged anyway." Rosie pulled her arm from her apron. "It was twisted. The bone healed wrong. He broke it before I left," she whispered. "A reminder to keep my mouth shut." Mara felt a fire ignite in her chest that was different from the rage she had felt for her father. This was not personal anymore. This was not just about her lost innocence or her father's betrayal. This was a monster eating a town alive. "There are others?" Mara asked. Rosie nodded. 5 or 6 girls up at the house, more in the saloon. They are scared. Mara, they have nowhere to go." Mara looked at Wyatt. His face was grim. His jaw set like granite. "We cannot just leave," she said. "I know." Wyatt said. Night fell over the town like a shroud. The music from the saloon drifted down the street, a tinny, frantic piano tune that sounded like forced laughter. In the hotel room, Mara and Wyatt lay in the narrow iron bed. They were fully dressed, save for their boots. The door was bolted, and a chair was wedged under the handle. The tension in the room was a physical thing. It coiled in the corners. It sat on their chests. Mara stared at the ceiling. She could feel Wyatt's body beside her, stiff and alert. "He is going to come for us tomorrow," she whispered. "Let him come," Wyatt said. "I am scared. Wyatt, I know." He turned on his side, pulling her into his arms. It was a desperate embrace. They clung to each other as if the floor were falling away. In the dark, with the sounds of the hostile town outside, they needed to feel something tender. They needed to remember that they were human, not just instruments of vengeance. Wyatt's hands moved over her, not with the practiced ease of their nights in the cabin, but with a frantic urgency. He touched her face, her neck, her shoulders, as if memorizing the shape of her. Mara buried her hands in his hair, pulling his mouth down to hers. She kissed him deep and hard, tasting the fear and the love on his tongue. "Make me forget," she whispered against his throat. "Just for an hour. Make me forget him." Their lovemaking was soft and urgent all at once. It was a silent conversation in the dark. Mara cupped Wyatt's face, her thumbs tracing the lines of his jaw. He whispered her name against her skin, over and over, a prayer and a shield. Every touch carried the unspoken weight of the dawn. They knew, without saying it, that this might be the last time, that tomorrow, bullets and fire might tear them apart. So they loved with everything they had. They poured their souls into the spaces where their bodies met, trying to build a fortress strong enough to withstand the morning. When it was over, they lay tangled together, sweating and breathless. The piano music down the street had stopped. The town was silent. Mara rested her head on Wyatt's chest. She felt his heart beating, strong, steady, alive. "We are going to end this," she whispered into the darkness. "For Rosie, for me, for all of them." Wyatt kissed the top of her head. His arm tightened around her, a band of steel. "We end it," he agreed. They did not sleep. They lay in the dark, eyes open, waiting for the sun to rise and bring the fire. The air in the town hung heavy and still, charged with the kind of oppressive electricity that precedes a summer thunderstorm. But there were no clouds in the sky, only a relentless, baking sun that turned the dust of the main street into a blinding white haze. For 3 days, Mara and Wyatt had moved through the shadows of the settlement, stitching together a fragile tapestry of resistance. It was slow, dangerous work. They spoke in hushed tones behind the livery stable, in the back room of the dry goods store, and near the water trough where the horses drank. They started with Rosie. The stable woman with the twisted arm was terrified, her eyes darting constantly toward the saloon that loomed over the town like a fortress. But beneath the fear, there was a simmering coal of hatred. Rosie whispered names to them, other women who had been used and discarded, families who had lost their deeds to a signature scrawled in a drunken haze. Then there was Mr. Abernathy, the storekeeper. He was a small, timid man who had watched Harlan Pike squeeze the life out of his neighbors for a decade. He showed them his own ledger, hidden beneath the floorboards, detailing the inflated prices Harlan forced him to charge and the kickbacks he was made to pay for protection. And there was Timmy, a stable boy of no more than 16 years. He walked with a limp, a gift from Harlan's foreman, Dutch, for speaking out of turn. The boy had seen things, money changing hands, threats delivered in the dead of night. It was not an army. It was barely a squad. But it was a start. Harlan Pike was not a man who missed much. He sat on the balcony of his saloon, drinking iced tea and watching the street. He saw the way people stopped to talk to the stranger in the duster coat. He saw the way heads bowed together in conversation. He smelled the smoke of rebellion, and he moved to stomp it out before it could catch fire. The rumors started first. They were insidious, planted by Harlan's men in the ears of the drunks and the gamblers. "Those two are grifters," the whispers went, trying to shake Harlan down. "The woman is a whore who stole from him, and the man is a rustler." The town, accustomed to bowing to power, began to turn. The glances directed at Mara and Wyatt grew colder. The door to the general store was locked when they approached. The preacher crossed the street to avoid them. Then came the violence. It happened on a Tuesday night. The moon was obscured by high clouds, plunging the alleys into ink-black darkness. Wyatt had gone to the livery to check on the horses, leaving Mara in the hotel room with the door bolted. He was on his way back, walking quickly, his hand near his gun. He heard a boot scrape on stone, but it was too late. A shadow detached itself from the wall of the warehouse. Then another. Before Wyatt could draw, something heavy and hard struck the back of his head. The world exploded into white light and pain. He fell to his knees, his vision swimming. A boot slammed into his ribs, knocking the wind out of him. "Hold him up!" a voice growled. It was Dutch. Rough hands grabbed Wyatt's arms, hauling him to his feet. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog, but a fist slammed into his stomach, doubling him over. Dutch grabbed a handful of Wyatt's hair, yanking his head back. "Harlan sends his regards." Dutch sneered, his breath smelling of onions and rot. "He says you have overstayed your welcome. Take the girl and ride out by dawn. If we see you tomorrow, we will bury you in the canyon." Dutch drew a knife. He brought the hilt down hard on Wyatt's temple, splitting the skin. Then he punched him in the mouth, a sickening crunch of teeth cutting into lip. They dropped him in the mud. Wyatt lay there, gasping for air, the taste of copper filling his mouth. He heard them laugh as they walked away, their boots heavy and confident. It took him 20 minutes to crawl back to the hotel. When Mara opened the door, her face went white. Wyatt stood in the hallway, swaying, his shirt torn and soaked in blood, one eye swollen shut, his lips split wide open. "Wyatt!" She pulled him inside, locking the door with trembling hands. She guided him to the bed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a sledgehammer. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice shaking. She fetched the basin and a cloth, and she wiped the blood from his face. Seeing the damage Harlan's men had inflicted, the fear that had been her constant companion for days suddenly vanished. It did not fade. It crystallized. It hardened into something cold and sharp and unbreakable. Wyatt hissed in pain as she touched his ribs. "We have to go," he rasped, spitting blood into the basin. "They will kill us. Mara, we cannot win this." Mara looked at his battered face. She looked at the man who had saved her life, the man who had built a home with her, the man who loved her enough to walk into hell beside her. And she saw what Harlan had tried to do. He had tried to break Wyatt to break her. She rinsed the cloth, the water turning pink. She wrung it out with hands that were steady as stone. "No," she said. "Mara," Wyatt pleaded, grabbing her wrist. "Look at me. We are alone here. We are not alone," she said. "And we are not leaving." She stood up, walking to the window. She looked out at the saloon down the street, blazing with light and noise. "My father sold me to pay a debt," she said quietly. "He sold me because he was weak. Harlan bought me because he thought he could own a person like he owns a cow. For years, I let that define me. I let the shame of it tell me who I was." She turned back to Wyatt, her eyes blazing with a terrifying fire. "If we leave now, Wyatt, we are just running again, and they will keep doing this. To Rosie, to Timmy, to every girl who has the bad luck to be born to a man who likes whiskey. I will not watch you be destroyed for me, and I will not let him win." She went to her saddlebags and pulled out her clean shirt, a white Sunday shirt she had packed. She changed quickly, tucking it into her trousers. She strapped her gun belt on, cinching it tight. "What are you doing?" Wyatt asked, struggling to sit up. "I'm going to close the account," she said. The saloon was full. It was a Wednesday night, but in Harlan Pike's town, every night was a night to drink. The air was thick with smoke, hanging in blue layers beneath the tin ceiling. The piano player was hammering out a lively tune, competing with the roar of laughter and the clink of glass. Harlan stood at the bar, holding court. He was laughing at a joke, his hand resting on the shoulder of the sheriff. Elias sat at a table in the corner, nursing a mug of beer, looking small and defeated. The bat-wing doors swung open. It was not a violent entrance. There was no shouting, no kicked doors, but something about the way the figure stood there, silhouetted against the dark street, made the room go quiet. The piano player faltered and stopped. The conversation died away, rippling outward from the door until the only sound was the hiss of the oil lamps. Mara stepped into the light. She stood straight-backed, her head high. She looked at no one but Harlan. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry and clear. Harlan turned slowly, a smirk touching his lips. "Well," he said, his voice carrying easily in the silence. "The little bird returns. I assume you are here to honor the contract?" Mara walked forward. The crowd parted for her, men stepping back as if she were contagious. She stopped 10 feet from Harlan. "There is no contract. Harlan," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was steady. It cut through the room like a blade. Harlan laughed, pulling a folded paper from his vest pocket. He waved it in the air. "I have it right here," he said, "signed and witnessed. 5 years of labor. You are late for your shift, my dear." He looked around the room, inviting the men to laugh. A few chuckled nervously, but most watched Mara. "That paper is a lie," Mara said. "It is not a contract for labor. It is a receipt for a human being." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the men who had been there 5 years ago. "You remember," she said. "You were here. You sat in these chairs and watched a father trade his 19-year-old daughter for a bottle of whiskey and a cleared tab. You laughed. You looked away. A murmur went through the crowd. Some men shifted their feet, looking down at their drinks. It was a business transaction, Harlan sneered, his smile slipping slightly. Your father had a debt. He paid it. That is the law. What law says a child is currency? Mara asked. What law says you can take a woman, beat her, starve her, and use her until she breaks? All for $40? She took a step closer. You are not a businessman. Harlan, you are a buyer of flesh. You prey on the weak. You get men drunk. You get them desperate. And then you take everything they have. Their land, their pride, their daughters. Harlan's face darkened. He signaled to Dutch, who was standing by the stairs. That is enough, Harlan snapped. Dutch, take her upstairs. Teach her some manners. Dutch stepped forward, grinning. Before he could reach her, the doors swung open again. Wyatt stood there. He was swaying, holding onto the doorframe. His face was a mask of blood and bruises, one eye swollen shut. He held a Colt revolver in his hand. He did not aim it, but he held it ready. If you touch her, Wyatt rasped, I will kill you. Dutch. Dutch hesitated. Mara did not look back. She kept her eyes on Harlan. You want to talk about the contract? She said. Let us ask the other party. She turned to the corner where her father sat. Elias, she shouted. The old man flinched, shrinking into his coat. Stand up. Pa, she commanded. Elias shook his head, mumbling into his beard. Stand up! The force of her voice dragged him to his feet. He stood there, trembling, a ruin of a man. Tell them, Mara said. Tell them what you sold me for. Elias looked at Harlan, who was glaring at him with cold warning. He looked at Mara. He looked at the daughter he had betrayed, standing tall and fierce in the center of the room. I owed money, Elias whispered. Louder, Mara demanded. What did you trade me for? Elias began to weep, tears leaking from his yellow eyes. A bottle, he sobbed. A bottle of whiskey, and $20 credit. The room went deathly silent. Even the hardest men, the ones who lived by the gun and the bottle, felt the ugliness of it. A father selling his daughter for a drink. It violated the code of the West, the unwritten law that said you protected your own blood. Harlan sensed the mood shifting. He saw the disgust on the faces of the townsfolk. He is a drunk, Harlan shouted. He does not know what he is saying. He knows, a voice said from the back. The crowd turned. The young preacher, Reverend Thomas, stepped forward. He was pale, but he looked determined. I saw the paper. Harlan, the preacher said, when you asked me to notarize the land deed last month, I saw the ledger. It says Mara, payment in full. The preacher looked at the men in the room. No piece of paper can sanctify a sin, he said, his voice gaining strength. To sell a child is an abomination. It is not law, it is slavery. The word hung in the air. Slavery. Harlan's face twisted into a snarl. He realized he was losing them. The aura of invincibility, the veneer of the respectable businessmen, was cracking. Get them out of here, Harlan screamed at his men. Clear the room. The Dutch lunged for Wyatt. Another guard reached for Mara. Chaos erupted. Wyatt fired a shot into the ceiling, the deafening crack stopping everyone for a heartbeat. Stay back, Wyatt roared. Harlan, desperate and furious, grabbed a heavy oil lantern from the bar. You think you can judge me, he screamed. I own this town. I own all of you. He threw the lantern at Mara. She dodged, but the glass shattered on the floorboards. The oil splashed across the dry wood, and the flame caught instantly. Fire, someone shouted. The fire spread with terrifying speed. It licked up the spilled whiskey on the floor, racing toward the bar. Smoke, black and acrid, filled the room instantly. Panic took hold. Men scrambled for the doors, overturning tables and chairs. Harlan did not run for the door. He ran for the office behind the bar. My ledgers, he shrieked. My books. He needed the books. The books were his power. They held the records of every debt, every mortgage, every soul he owned. Mara saw him run. She saw the flames climbing the curtains. She ran after him. Mara! Wyatt shouted, coughing in the smoke. Mara reached the bar just as Harlan emerged from the office, clutching a stack of heavy leather-bound books. His eyes were wide with madness. "Get out of my way!" Harlan screamed. Mara stood her ground. The heat was intense, singing the hair on her arms. "It is over. Harlan," she said. She grabbed the top ledger from his stack. He tried to hold on to it, but she wrenched it free. "No!" he cried. Mara looked at the book. It was heavy. It contained the names of half the town. It contained her name. She turned and threw it into the heart of the fire. The pages curled and blackened. The ink boiled. She grabbed another and another. Harlan dropped the rest, trying to dive into the flames to save them. "My money, my debts." Mara watched him. For a split second, she considered pushing him in. It would be so easy. A shove, and he would burn with his greed. But she looked at his face, twisted, pathetic, screaming for paper while the roof collapsed. He was already dead. The man he thought he was had been consumed. She stepped back. Wyatt appeared at her side, grabbing her arm. The smoke was blinding now. "Leave him!" Wyatt coughed. "The roof is going!" Wyatt pulled her back. Mara looked at Harlan one last time. He was on his knees, surrounded by fire, clutching a burning book to his chest, weeping not for his soul, but for his gold. Wyatt dragged her through the inferno, out into the cool night air. They stumbled into the street, gasping for breath. The entire saloon was a torch. Flames punched through the roof, sending sparks spiraling up into the black sky. The townspeople had formed a bucket line, passing water from the creek, but they were not throwing water on the saloon. They were wetting down the general store and the livery stable next door. They stood and watched the palace burn. They let it fall. The warehouse caught next, the grain and whiskey fueling the blaze until it roared like a dragon. The heat pushed the crowd back. Mara stood with Wyatt, his arm around her shoulders. She watched the structure collapse inward with a mighty crash. The sign, Pike's Palace, fell into the street, charred and broken. It was done. The ledgers were ash. The debts were smoke. Harlan Pike stumbled out the back door, singed and coughing, clutching nothing but soot. He fell to his knees in the dirt, screaming at the sky, but no one moved to help him. He had lost his wealth, his proof, and his fear. He was just a small, burnt man in a town that no longer owed him anything. The next morning, the air smelled of wet char and freedom. Mara stood by the river, watching the water flow over the stones. The sun was rising, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. She heard footsteps behind her. She turned. It was Elias. He looked worse than ever. His coat was scorched, his face smeared with soot. He held his hat in his hands, turning it round and round. "Mara," he croaked. She did not speak. She waited. I am sorry," he said. The words were quiet, broken. "I was weak. Girl, I was a bad father. The drink. It took me." He looked up at her, his eyes pleading for absolution. "I can change. Mara, now that he is gone, maybe I can come with you. I can work. I can mend fences." Mara looked at him. She looked at the man who had given her life and then sold it. She felt the old ache, the desire to be a daughter, to be loved. But she also felt the steel in her spine. She thought of the nights she had spent screaming in her sleep. She thought of the bruises on Wyatt's face. "No, Pa," she said. Elias flinched. "Mara, please, I am your kin. You are my father?" she said softly. "That will never change, but you are not my family. Not anymore." She took a step closer to him. "I do not forgive you," she said. Elias crumbled, burying his face in his hands. "But," she continued, her voice steady, "I will not carry your sin anymore. It is yours to hold. I am putting it down right here, by this river." She turned away from him. "Goodbye, Elias." She walked up the bank, her boots crunching on the gravel. She did not look back at the sound of his weeping. She left him there with his guilt and the water. That was punishment enough. Wyatt was waiting for her by the horses. He had bandaged his ribs and cleaned the blood from his face, though he was still moving stiffly. "Ready?" he asked. Mara took the reins of her horse. She looked at the town one last time. People were already clearing the rubble. Rosie was standing by the livery, watching them. She raised her good hand in a wave. Mara nodded back. "I am ready," she said. They mounted up and turned their horses north. They rode out of the valley, leaving the ghosts behind. They did not talk for a long time. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the knowledge of what they had done. They had faced the monster and won. Days later, they crested the ridge overlooking their own land. The cabin sat there, small and sturdy against the vastness of the plains. Smoke curled from the chimney. Old Silas Miller had kept the fire going for them. It was dusk. The first stars were pricking the violet sky. They reined in their horses on the ridge. The wind was blowing, cold and sharp, but it felt clean. It felt like their wind. Mara slid down from the saddle. Wyatt dismounted beside her. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. She leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body. "We are home," he whispered. Mara rested her hand on her abdomen. It was a subconscious gesture, a protective touch, beneath the heavy wool of her coat, beneath the skin and muscle. She felt a secret hum of life, a new beginning, a fragile, fierce hope growing in the dark. She smiled, watching the horizon. "We are home," she agreed. Wyatt turned her in his arms. He looked down at her face, tracing the line of her jaw with his thumb. He kissed her, slow and deep. It was not the kiss of a savior, nor a master. It was the kiss of a partner, a man who had chosen her when she was nothing but a debt, and who had been chosen in return. The old wounds were there. They would always be there, but they were scars now, not open sores. Mara turned back to the east, watching the sky lighten with the promise of the dawn. Her eyes held the reflection of the rising sun. There was fire in them still, not the destructive fire of the saloon, but the steady, enduring flame of a woman who had walked through hell and come out the other side holding her own life in her hands. She was Mara. She was free, and the future was wide open. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust and shadows of the American West, and I hope Mara and Wyatt's fight for freedom resonated with you. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Please leave a comment below and tell me which part of the world you call home. If you enjoyed this tale of resilience and justice, please consider subscribing to the channel From Wild West. Your support helps us bring more of these stories to life. And finally, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the ending. Did Mara make the right choice leaving her father behind? Share your thoughts in English in the comments. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.